So, 2 weeks ago we started talking about pop culture and Christianity and the intersection of those two things and the conflict between those two things. Last week we took a look at two different sort of, I won't say competing, but alternative mythologies that we find in pop culture when it comes to heroes. The first one is by a guy named Joseph Campbell, who created what he called the monomyth. And to be more accurate, he would probably say that he aggregated, he pulled together from a lot of different sources across a lot of different cultures the ideas that go into what he called the heroic journey, the idea of a hero who starts out in a normal life and is thrown into something unexpected or unusual and goes through a process before ultimately coming back around to re-enter normal life, but changed in some way. And I told you last week, and of course it worked phenomenally well because so many of you had seen the Star Wars movies, that Luke Skywalker is the ultimate probably expression of this particular idea, because George Lucas, who created Star Wars, went out of his way to very carefully copy this down. But you can go through and you can look at elements of this in a lot of other places. More recently, for those of you who actually do follow Hollywood to some extent, in the journey of Iron Man and Tony Stark in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he goes through a process very much like this. You can even look at it on a smaller scale with just bits and pieces of the monomyth with characters like the guy from Die Hard, who starts off on a normal day and his day gets really, really crazy when terrorists take over the airport where his wife is trying to, come in for landing on a plane as a passenger. So in most movies that involve a relatively ordinary person, this is the framework or an element of the framework, and it works in two ways. Partly that's true because Joseph Campbell was very good at identifying the elements that go into a heroic story, and partly it's true because ever since Campbell wrote this book back in the 1950s, I think it was, a lot of Hollywood directors and writers have used this concept in a relatively deliberate way to a greater or lesser extent. Lucas was the one who did it the most, and that's why I called the attention to him, but that didn't work as well last week, so I thought we'd go with something a little bit more up-to-date, or maybe a little bit more permeated the culture and consciousness of you guys. So, anyway, but there is another significant heroic mythology, and that particular heroic mythology does not follow the pattern of this monomyth. And we're going to talk more about the monomyth in some later classes, but for today we started talking yesterday about a different heroic mythology, one where the main character was never ordinary, and that is the mythology of Superman. Superman is a character who was never ordinary when it comes to what he did. He grows up extraordinary. He's from another planet. He's got superpowers that he gains because of the environment of Earth, depending on which version of him you're talking about. It's because of the different gravity and atmosphere. In other versions, it's because of the yellow sun versus a red sun. Whatever the reason is, basically from the point he gets to Earth onward, he is developing superpowers. So he's never really normal. And so his mythology has more to do with concealing himself and creating an alternative identity for himself that he can work off of while he does heroic things. And so his struggle is not to deal with the unusual while being ordinary. His struggle is how to have a degree of normalcy and ordinariness in a life that is otherwise filled with superhuman. How does he fit into a world that he isn't really like? And we talked yesterday, or sorry, I'm going to say yesterday more than once, but I'm getting better because now I've been out of school for a week. So hopefully by the end of this, I will be back on, when I go back to school, I'll be talking about next Sunday when I'm talking to my students, so that'll be fun. Anyway, so the Superman mythology surrounds the idea of heroism, and we took a look at the trailer for the 1978 Superman movie that had Christopher Reeves in it, and it has significant mythology or elements to it that we can see very clearly where they're drawing on elements of the Christ mythology, or not mythology, the Christ story, or alternatively, and probably because of the guys who wrote it, Mosaic mythology. The Mosaic mythology, and when you think about it in those terms, well, actually, let me ask you guys, how many of you were here last Sunday? Some of you were not, a few of you were not. Okay, so I know this is a struggle, but I'm going to ask you to think back to last Sunday. and tell me if you can remember anything in the prequel or the trailer that we watched that would tie the story of Superman in, not to the Christ story, but to the Mosaic story. You can't remember that far back, can you?
No, I don't know what Mosaic is.
The story of Moses.
Oh, I didn't see.
Let's try this again. I'm going to show this to you again, and we're going to see if you can figure this. Okay, go ahead.
Well, the parents transported him.
Okay.
Right? Like they put him in something special to transport him
Okay.
away.
There, in the original 1978 Superman movie, there is a very, it's actually relatively drawn out scene in which Superman's parents put him into this ship, but he's a baby, and so he's placed in there, and it's almost more like a crib that they put him in, and then it closes over him and it goes out, and it travels across interstellar space. All of which looks an awful lot like the Mosaic story, the Moses story, in terms of being put into, and by the way, his culture, Superman's culture, is being wiped out. Now in that case it's by natural disaster, but nevertheless, much like the Hebrews in Egypt are experiencing the destruction of their culture, or the attempted destruction of their culture, Superman is sent away. And he is sent away with the notion that his job, what he can be, is an example to the people, a rescuer to the people of the planet to whom he's sent. So there is a blending there of what we see in the story of Moses and what we see in the story of Christ, because of that sort of person from an outer world kind of thing. And so there's an element to which the 1978 movie begins to transition from the original Superman stories tended to be much more in the Moses train. And by the 1970s, when you're trying to reach a more grown-up audience than just kids, they begin to transition to a story that's more familiar and comfortable to most Americans, which is the story of Jesus, and the way that we have the rescuer who's sent by his father to save us.
You don't think this is, you think this is on purpose and not just coincidental?
I think there's an element of that, yes. Because you don't, well, just wait, okay? so I think that in the, well, we'll get to more of the why of this, but remember, Siegel and Schuster are both Jewish guys, and they're probably writing with some Jewish influences in the way that they're thinking. Because in general, we don't just come up with stories out of nothing that have no connection to anything else. They connect either to things that we've experienced, to stories that we have heard, to stories that we want to tell, almost whatever it is. There's nothing that completely new when it comes to creating fiction.
Freud, whatever his name was.
Freud. Sigmund Freud, yes.
That's his position, that there is nothing that is created that doesn't come from something.
And I think that that's generally true when we talk about human endeavor. Now, when we're talking about God's endeavors, that's a different thing, and that kind of speaks maybe to the way Paul says that the mystery or the wisdom of God is beyond men, and the foolishness of God is wiser than men's wisdom, because he can actually come up and create new things. And that's, I mean, the creation story is the story of creating something new, out of nothing. And we are not capable of doing that. What we do is we create out of what we see, we create out of what we feel. We may pull together something that is unique in the sense that nobody's created that exact thing before, but it is influenced by the things that we have experienced. And Hollywood, by and large, is influenced by things that have come before them, and by things that they are experiencing, and by ideologies that they are trying to express, for better or for worse. That is the reality of what we see with most of what Hollywood does, is it contains elements of all those things. And so there's some usefulness to us, and this goes back to my original point in why we're doing this. There's some usefulness for us in that sometimes in the things that Hollywood creates, we can find ways to speak to somebody who doesn't know anything about the Gospels or about the Bible and say, well, it's like that, only better. But there's also a danger because, number one, Hollywood often takes ideas that are Christian in origin or godly in origin and warps them in ways that then make us respond to them as though they are good things because they look a lot like the good things that we're used to. And that's the really dangerous part, because Hollywood is very good at that. And I mentioned this before, but it's really important we remember this, so I'm probably going to mention it several times again. It is critical to remember that when you watch a movie, when you watch a television show, when you read a novel, that every aspect of what you're experiencing is controlled by the people who wrote the script and who directed the movie or the TV show or the editor who edited the book. Those things do not happen by accident. They do not happen because the actors inhabit those characters. Now, the actors are a factor, let me clarify that. They're a factor in how that performance goes. You can think about two different actors who did the same role and the differences in terms of how they performed it. There's definitely an element of that. But all of those things are artificial. And so you like a character in a TV show, great. But understand you like a fictional character. And just because that character articulates things that you either agree with or don't agree with doesn't mean that it should have any more or less weight than anyone else, because ultimately that's a made-up character. And so if Hollywood, if a movie wants you to believe that somebody who does evil things is a nuanced character with good reasons for what they do, they can write them that way. And they can make them somebody that you sympathize with and that you tend to agree with in places that you might otherwise not. A great example of this, from my own personal life indirectly, is the movie Philadelphia. Anybody in here seen the movie Philadelphia? It goes back to the early 1990s, late 1980s, I think. It's one of Denzel Washington. No, it's not Denzel Washington. I can't remember. Anyway, I believe it's Tom Hanks is the lawyer, and Antonio Banderas, I believe, is actually his client. And the movie portrays a situation where this homosexual homosexual individual who worked in a professional capacity. I want to say he was a lawyer, but I'm not sure about that. He got sick with AIDS. This was back during the kind of the height of the AIDS epidemic, and he was fired from his company as a result of being sick with this. And they were able to tell that he was sick because he was having to take a lot of personal time, and he was also developing outward symptoms and stuff like that. And so ultimately the story is about the lawyer, Hanks, trying to sue the company for wrongful termination because they basically terminated him for being sick and not for any legally valid purpose. And when you watch the movie, it is possible, if you're a lawyer like I am, to distinguish between the fact that this guy is a homosexual and the fact that while his behavior is probably what led him to his situation, the law firm or the company that he worked for, their response was wrong. Because within the framework of our laws, it's clear that their response was wrong. The movie is about them revealing that in court. And to recognize the difference between that being a truth and then sympathizing with the conduct that led him to that situation. But not everybody makes that distinction. And so my mom was talking to a friend of hers, and her friend said, after watching that movie, it really made her sympathize with the gay community. And my mom said, why? And she said, well, because they were, all these bad things were happening. And my mom said, well, first of all, you realize that while this is based on a true story, it's fictionalized in many ways. The characters are dressed up to make you like them better. And the point that the movie's trying to make is exactly what she absorbed, even though that's really not what the movie is portraying. The movie is portraying somebody who did something unjust getting a consequence for it in terms of the way that this guy's company had worked, but there's not necessarily a relationship between that being wrong and somehow what this other guy is doing being right. And so it's very easy when we look at movies and TV shows and books to start running into situations where Hollywood is trying to tell you something and they're portraying it in a way where your tendency is not simply to say, okay, well, I can see where this is true, but this isn't true. Your tendency is to say, well, I see where that could be right, And so the characters that you see tend to be the characters that they want you to see and portray ideas that they want you to portray. Now, that doesn't always work the way Hollywood wanted. One of the most famous examples, and this is what I was talking about a couple of weeks ago in my sermon where I used All in the Family. And Norman Lear, Norman Lear? Anyway, the creator of that show, Lear, created Archie Bunker to be this racist, misogynistic character that he intended to embody all of the worst personalities of his father, because he expected that he would put him on television and everybody would go, oh, we don't want to be like that. But he put him on television, he became the most important and beloved character in the series, and not, it wasn't that everybody's going, oh, we want to be like that, but everybody's like, oh yeah, we can see why he's like that. And Lear, after a couple of years of the show, is like, this is not what was supposed to happen, you know? So it doesn't always work the way that Hollywood wants it to, but a lot of times it does, particularly if we don't think about what we're seeing and recognize what's going on as we go through that. So what I want to do as we go through the Superman mythology a little bit more is I want you to continue to pay attention, number one, to ways in which this reflects biblical stories, because it reflects several of them. The Mosaic one, certainly, the Christ one, secondly, and some other ones kind of along in there. So I want you to think about how it reflects those things, but I also want you to notice the transformation from what we saw in that first preview, or first trailer that we watched last week, and then several different ones. So there's been a series of different Superman movies since the one that we looked, the 1978 version of it. There was a Superman Returns movie that was based out of the same sort of timeline as that particular set of movies was. It started a guy named Brandon Ruth who had an uncanny similarity to Christopher Reeves to the point where they just put him into the role and said, close enough, and ran with it. Then there was a kind of a reboot where they created a movie called Man of Steel, and that series went on for several movies. And now this summer there's going to be another one. And based on what I'm seeing in the trailers, there's still a lot of overlap with the Christ story because of the way that the world is reacting against him and some things like that. So, but I want you to see how as we go through this, the mythology becomes more and more explicit in terms of what they're saying. So let's start with the trailers for, this is the trailers for Superman Returns. So this is directed or written by some of the same people that were involved with the original Superman movies that starred Christopher Reeves. And so it's a continuation of the story that we see in that trailer that we watched last week. So this is a couple of different trailers for that movie, at least hopefully.
You've been gone a long time. Where'd you go?
Easy for me to live my life being who I am, keeping secrets.
Clark, hey, welcome back. I see you've already met the Munchkin.
Hello. Yeah, well, you've been gone. Fearless reporter Lois Lane is a mommy. But if you ask me, she's still in love with you-know-who.
How could you make us like that? I moved on. So did the rest of us. The world doesn't need a savior. And neither do I. Lex Luthor.
This is kind of a little reunion, isn't it? I'm a fan. I'll have advanced technology. Thousands of years beyond what anyone could throw at me.
But millions of people will die.
Billions! You wrote that the world doesn't need a savior, but every day I hear people crying for one. Come on, let me hear you say it just once.
You're insane.
No! No, the other thing.
Superman will
Run!
So we're going to kind of go through this as we go along. Tell me what you see in there that jumps out at you that relates to the biblical stories that we know. What are some of the things that jump out at you? Mark?
I wrote down mine. Long time waiting. They waited a long time. They knew they were supposedly going to have a savior. So it was that long time. In that show there, he'd been gone.
Right, and what happens in the movie, they don't go into this in a lot of detail in the movie, but actually they cut this out. There's a scene, you can find it online, that actually shows what he did was at after the events of the second Superman movie. They pretend like the third and fourth one didn't happen because they were really bad. And so after the events of the second Superman movie, he went back to Krypton because the scientists were able to identify where it was, and it looked like it was still a planet. So he uses a ship that he is able to create out of his Fortress of Solitude to travel there, finds out that it just looks like it's intact. It's actually exploded, but gravity has pulled the pieces back together. And immediately the kryptonite of that begins to affect him, and so the ship has to bring him back home. Because of the distance and time of the journey, he's gone for a number of years, for I don't know, 5 or 6 years, something like that, on this journey before he comes back. So the people of the world have been looking for Superman because he'd been there for several years before that, so they're waiting for this return, okay? So one of these things that we see is this theme of waiting for a return. What else do we see?
Well, as soon as he shows up, they said, we don't need you.
Okay, so one of the things is that at least some of the people, particularly the ones that knew him the best, said, we don't need you. We don't want you, that kind of a thing, okay? And what immediately, if you've seen the movie especially, what immediately becomes apparent? They need him, yeah. So that the woman who actually, this Lois Lane, who said to him, we don't need you, she's on board a plane that's about to crash, and he's the one who saves it, and probably one of the most impressive pieces of cinematography when it comes to superheroes anyway that I've ever seen. So, so what else? What else do we see?
It's a classic battle between good and evil.
Okay, who's the bad guy?
The bald guy.
Lex Luthor, the bald guy. Thank you. Yeah. So, and who is? I mean, and we're not being subtle about this. Who is Lex Luthor meant to portray? Satan. He is absolutely. I mean, Kevin Spacey nails that one. He is absolutely. Gene Hackman in the original Superman movie in 1978 was kind of he was evil, but he was also kind of funny in the way that they portrayed him. He was a little bit, there was a bit of humor built into it. Kevin Spacey is absolutely just evil all the way through this thing. What else?
Well, I think too, just to your point there, in the 70s, the villain was also kind of portrayed as kind of a buffoon in a lot of instances, and I think Kevin Spacey plays the part more accurate to what the villain is, and I think he also shows what I got from that little clip was arrogance.
Yeah.
Right? No, wrong.
Yeah. He's got a plan, and he's arrogant. And what else? This is tricky. And we're going to watch another preview from this movie, so we'll come back to this in a minute here. But I want you to think about what else you see in terms of what the devil does in that movie specifically. And like I said, we'll come back and talk about that in a minute once we watch the other trailer. What else do you see in terms of the events in there that would tie Kevin Spacey into the devil? Anything else that you noticed?
Fire.
Okay, fire. There's this not, and he's the one that causes, he does something that causes that to happen. It causes all of basically it causes an explosion under the city, under Metropolis, and it blows open all of these manhole covers with fire coming up out of it. So you have this very clear difference. And Superman's Fortress of Solitude, anybody know where Superman's Fortress of Solitude is located? There's ice. Yeah, it's actually like near the North Pole. It's in the Arctic Circle area. So there's a contrast between the ice that Superman is, the cold, and the heat of the villain here. But there's a very clear, effort to make Luthor clearly be the villain in this. Okay, let's go and watch the second trailer from this and see kind of what else we can see in here, because we start to see some other themes emerging as this goes along.
Even though you've been raised as a human being, you are not one of them.
not exactly what I thought it was. I mean, I knew that it was there. I think I kind of got them out of order, actually. So this trailer is specifically focusing on that's similar to that we've already kind of talked about, son.
The only son thing.
The only son thing. He's the savior kind of a thing. It talks about they're great people, they want to be, that kind of stuff.
But it also has them taking a lot of introspective time, like Jesus would go off into the wilderness.
So one of the things it hits on is that, and also if you notice this, and we see this in both trailers, there's a point at which Superman has to leave Lois Lane behind. And he's not able to have entirely a normal life because of the way that what he's called to do and what he does. And that's very similar to the Christ mythology of, that he's in the world, but he's not really of the world, the same way he wants his disciples to be. But that comes with relationships and other things like that as well. And so there are parallels being made there as well. Now, the one that I did not, unfortunately, it's not in this one. I thought there was more about this in this one. But what we see happening with Luthor is that Luthor develops, if you saw in the first clip, he talks about he'd have technology that was thousands of years ahead of Earth's technology. Where's he going to get that from, do you think?
Krypton.
Oh, he's going to get it from Krypton, or more specifically, what he's going to do, and this is where we see that ship traveling through the ice-covered waters. What he's going to do is he's going to break into Superman's Fortress of Solitude while Superman is away and steal some of his technology. And what does this start to look like when we talk about the stories in the Bible of Satan? Okay, that's true, definitely, yeah.
Fallen angel.
It's a fallen angel. He breaks into, in this case, heaven. The Fortress of Solitude is made to look very different from anything on this world. It's got a lot of crystal color, kind of looks to it. It's very white, it's very pristine. Lex Luthor goes in there and steals stuff from there to help himself with his urge to take over the world. This is very, very, it's warping, but it's nevertheless significantly rooted in the story of the rebellion of Satan and the fall of Satan. And the fact that Satan is using things that God created and warping them. One of the truths about Satan that we talk about sometimes, but not very often, is Satan doesn't really have a lot of original ideas. He just takes the stuff that God has created and he turns it into something messed up and gets people to abuse it. Whether it's, turning love into sex and we get it that way, or turning, the priorities that we would normally have, affection for our family or hard work or whatever, and turning them into obsessions, or, most of the things, the idea when he says to Adam and Eve, or to Eve specifically, if you eat this, you'll be like God. He's taking that pride and that desire to be like God that we naturally have, and he's turning it into something sinful. So Satan uses the things that God has created to tempt us by warping them. And that's kind of the idea here. So there's a lot of very deliberate efforts to set this up in a way that speaks to at least what I would call deliberate efforts. I don't know if the filmmakers would agree with me, but I think that whether they meant to or not, they incorporated a lot of stuff in there that impacts the way that we think about, or that is drawing on things that we are comfortable with already to create a mythology. Now, before we're done here, either this week, today, or next week, we're going to talk about the problems with this. So don't think that I'm telling you this is all just great because it's the Christ story and everything else, because there's some significant problems with this as well. But I want to jump ahead almost 15 years to, or maybe 10 or 15 years to Man of Steel, which was released much more recently, just about 7 years ago, I want to say, something like that, with a whole different set of actors, and also rebooting or restarting the Superman mythology. Now, it keeps a lot of the pieces intact, but it changes certain elements of it. And so we're going to watch a couple of trailers from that as well and see what we see in that. That's Krypton.
Hopes and dreams travel with you.
You've been outcast. I'll get her.
How? I'll be a god to them.
What if a child dreamed of becoming something other than what society had intended? What if a child aspired to something greater?
son was in the bus. He saw what Clark did.
You're the answer, son. You're the answer to are we alone in the universe?
Can I just keep pretending I'm your son?
You are my son. I have to believe that you were sent here for a reason. And even if it takes the rest of your life, you owe it to yourself to find out what that reason is.
How do you find someone who has spent a lifetime covering his tracks? For some, he was a guardian angel. For others, a ghost who never quite fit in.
You will give the people of Earth an ideal to strive towards. They will race behind you. They will stumble. They will fall. But in time, they will join you in the sun. In time, you will help them accomplish wonders.
You believe your son is safe?
I will find him! I fully believe if the world found out where it really was, they could check me. He was convinced that the world wasn't ready. What do you think?
What's the S stand for?
It's not an S. In my world, it means hope.
Well, here is an S. How about super?
Excuse me.
Okay, like I said, they're getting less and less subtle here. So what are some of the things that jump out at you with this version?
And two fathers.
Two fathers, okay, what else?
War in heaven.
War in heaven, literally in the skies. There's a war. Now, go ahead.
No one believed they didn't believe he is who he said he is.
Okay.
When Jesus came, I'm the Messiah, and they're like, no. And then
Okay.
he's like, in my world, it means hope or whatever. They're like,
Right.
Okay, sure.
And one of the things that we don't see in this preview, and we may see in the next trailer, but one of the things we see is that he is massively distrusted by the government, of the U.S. government in particular, because somebody with his kind of power who's not under their control makes them very afraid. And again, we see some real parallels with Jesus in terms of that, in terms of how the authorities reacted to him. So one of the things here, now Lex Luthor is not the bad guy in this movie. The character Zod, who you see him fighting at the end, and you see him briefly where he talks about, I will find him, that's definitely the devil character. In his case, Zod is part of the reason that the situation on Krypton falls apart. He leads a civil war on Krypton against the people who are in charge, and ultimately is imprisoned in an alternate reality that's kind of this horrible place to be as a consequence of that. Anybody want to comment on the parallels of that? I mean, that was really straightforward, right? I mean, like I said, they're getting less and less subtle about some of these things in terms of how these characters are set up. And here again, we also see this, now we see this struggle to kind of reconcile who he is with who he's supposed to be and who he wants to be and some of those kinds of things, which does not entirely reflect Christ's situation. We never see anything in Christ's situation that reflect the idea that he was unwilling to accept his job, his duty, except in the Garden of Eden, where we do see him struggling with, with doing his Father's will. But in this one, because he has two fathers, there's two competing ideas here. Jor-El, the father from Krypton, played by Russell Crowe, sends him to Earth to be this hero. His father in the movie wants him to keep his powers a secret because he doesn't think that the world's ready for him yet. And when he says that at the end, he's referring to his natural father. Here again, although Jesus' father is presumably dead by the time his ministry begins, and we know this because when his mother and his brothers go to kind of try to bring him home, his father is with him, and that would normally be what would happen, is he would go along, and if he wasn't in agreement with it, they wouldn't have gone in the first place. But the parallel that we see there is his human father, Jesus' human family is trying to get him to not do the things that he's doing. And Superman's human father is trying to prevent him from doing the things that he is meant to do as well. And so we continue to see these parallels here. So one last trailer, and then we'll talk a little bit more about this.
World's too big, Mom. Then make it small. Focus on my voice. Pretend it's an island out in the ocean. Can you see it? I see it. My son was in the bus. He saw what Clark did.
You have to keep this side of yourself a secret.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe. I have so many questions. Where do I come from? You just have to decide what kind of man you want to grow up to be, Clark. Whoever that man is. He's going to change the world. My father believed that if the world found out where he was, it would get me. He was convinced that the world wasn't ready. What do you think?
All right, so it's kind of interesting because we've got two trailers that are kind of the introspective ones and two trailers that are a little bit more of the action-based ones. But what's interesting with this trailer is it focuses a lot more, and the movie focused quite a lot more on Superman's process of growing from thinking in terms of himself as not as a human exactly, but growing up in the world. And then it's actually only in about the last third of the movie that he adopts the mantle of Superman and actually begins to do heroic things. Up until that point, he's mostly kept his identity a secret. But he's struggling with this idea. So we have some similarities to Christ, but we also have some significant differences. What are some of the big differences there that you see in what was going on in that trailer and in the previous ones that we've had?
Christ had no doubt.
Okay, so Christ, when he's 12 years old in the temple, when his parents leave him and come back to get him and they're mad at him, what is his response?
I'm about my father's business.
That's right. Didn't you know I was supposed to be about my father's business? I'm here doing this thing. You know, there's no point at which that we see in the scriptures, reflected in the scriptures, that Jesus is shown as having any doubt about his purpose or what his role is supposed to be. Now, there is, like I said, there's the point in the Garden of Eden where, sorry, not the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Gethsemane, where he doesn't want to do it because he understands what's coming, and so he's asking for a way out, but he's also accepting his Father's will. So he knows what's coming, and so he's not trying to find himself. At any point in Christ's ministry do we see him trying to find himself and figure out what kind of person he should be. So we start to see some differences here. Now, here's one of the reasons that this is critical, and that I'm bringing this out. This is the last thing we're going to talk about today because we're about to run out of time. But one of the critical differences here, and if you watch most and you read most pop culture versions of Jesus' life, whether it is something like some of the different movies that have been made about his life, with the exception arguably the Passion of the Christ, but even that one has some elements of this. But particularly when you look at some that were particularly condemned by Christians, like I'm trying to think of the name of the one that was created in the 80s that was really, really messed up. I cannot think of it right now. Anyway, almost every portrayal of Christ that comes out of Hollywood itself tends to portray him as having doubts, as having questions, as not really being entirely on board with what his role is. And it typically portrays his disciples, at least to some extent, some of them being part of the reason that he's able to push through and do what he's supposed to do. And what we see in the scriptures is never that. We never see Jesus having doubts. We see the disciples being the ones who are oftentimes impediments, and he has to sort of drag along out of ignorance into understanding in order for them to understand what he's trying to do. So there is this particular idea about Jesus is one that has very broadly infected pop culture and American thinking about God in general. Because the notion of a universally good God who doesn't have any flaws or failings or weaknesses, and Jesus was human, so he had the weaknesses of a human, he was tempted and stuff like that, but never succumbed to those things. The notion of somebody like that is something that Hollywood just can't handle, because it runs directly contrary to their message of moral relativism. If there is in fact a God, and there was in fact a son who did everything right, then moral relativism has to be a lie, it has to be wrong. And so Hollywood can't stand that, and so it has to create Christ figures that are flawed and imperfect. And it's kind of interesting because when you go back and you look at that 1978 movie, Superman has very few human failings and weaknesses. He tends to make the right choice all the time. There's really no exploration of whether he really wants to do the stuff that he does or not. For the most part, he does everything right, except at the very end of the movie when he ignores what his original father, is telling him to do. Whereas as you move through the Superman mythology and you get more and more modern, you find more and more of this doubt and hesitation and willingness to compromise himself and stuff like that as he goes through, until in this particular movie he actually kills somebody at the end in order to prevent greater harm from being done, which is one of the cardinal rules of Superman, is that he doesn't kill people. So what we're seeing is that Hollywood is using the Superman mythology to introduce this idea that nobody's perfect, and that even God is not really perfect. And I suspect we're going to see even more of that in this new movie that's supposed to be coming out. But they're very carefully crafting this so that the way that we think about the things that we believe in is altered and undermined in certain ways. And this is why I say it's dangerous. I'm not saying going and seeing a Superman movie is necessarily a sinful or bad thing, because I'll probably go see the next one too. And the reason I know about all these trailers is because I've seen these movies. What I'm saying is that when you pay attention to movies, or when you watch movies, you watch TV, pay attention to what you're seeing portrayed, because it's influencing the way you think in ways that you might not normally relate because of the differences between what you think you're seeing and the message that's underlying them. Okay? So we'll talk more about this next week when we finish up Superman, and then we'll move on to something different from there. And again, I want to be really clear about this. I'm not trying to say that all pop culture is bad. Obviously, I don't think that, or I wouldn't, watch as much of it and read as much of it as I do. But I do think we have to be very careful about how we think about it, and that's the goal of this, is neither to say good or bad, but just watch what you're handling.
With the influence of other countries making movies and coming in, is their context different from the American-made movie?
It is, yes, and I'm gonna write that question down, and I will talk about it a little bit more next week, because we're already several minutes over, and I don't want to take too much longer. But I'll make a note of that, and we'll come back and we'll talk about it. There's similarities and there's differences, and to some extent the trend tells different stories too. So, okay, so we're going to stop. We're going to take a 10-15 minute break, and then we'll come back for worship after that.